What if I told you that a dead man changed the course of World War II, that an ordinary body, chosen and prepared with meticulous care, deceived the enemy and saved thousands of lives? Today, we dive into the chilling true story of Operation Mincemeat, a mission so audacious, so twisted, it blurs the line between life and death, truth and illusion. Stay with me, because every shadow in this story hides a secret, and by the end, you won't believe what war can really do. In 1943, the Allied command faced a grim reality. The planned invasion of Sicily promised strategic advantage, yet intelligence reports warned of catastrophic casualties. War rooms across London were filled with maps, charts, and the weight of uncertainty. Officers whispered in low tones, their breath mingling with the faint fog that drifted in from the windows. Every decision seemed to carry the possibility of thousands of lives lost in a single miscalculation. British naval and intelligence departments convened in secrecy. They reviewed enemy troop placements, supply lines, and coastal defenses. The Mediterranean Sea, usually serene, now seemed like a dark, threatening corridor. The council knew that brute force alone could not guarantee success. A more subtle weapon was needed. Deception, they agreed, might be their only chance. The psychological battlefield was as vital as the physical one. Maps of Sicily were spread across tables, each contour line representing villages, hills, and beaches that might be defended by German troops. Officers leaned over them, tracing possible landing points and calculating the odds. They discussed false attacks, phantom convoys, and misinformation campaigns. Every option was weighed with clinical precision, but none seemed sufficient to distract the enemy. Then, a suggestion emerged so audacious it startled the room into silence. One officer proposed using a corpse as a tool of deception. At first, the idea seemed grotesque, almost unthinkable. Yet, as discussion continued, its potential became clear. A body, carefully prepared with falsified documents, might mislead German intelligence about Allied plans. It was a strategy that relied on both imagination and audacity, turning death itself into a weapon. The officers debated the risks. If the plan failed, it could not only cost the life of the chosen individual, but also compromise the entire invasion. They spoke of the enemy reading letters, examining receipts, and trusting what they believed to be a genuine officer. Every detail would need to be perfect. A single error could alert the Germans and lead to disaster. Yet, if successful, the deception could save countless soldiers from bloodshed on Sicilian beaches. Even as the idea was discussed in detached, analytical terms, the psychological weight was evident. Men leaned back in their chairs, rubbing tired eyes, imagining waves of Allied soldiers striking the coast while German forces scrambled in the wrong direction. They understood that this was not a conventional battle. Here, the mind was both the weapon and the battlefield. Outside, fog swirled over London streets, a reflection of the uncertainty inside the war room. Maps, papers, and whispered calculations formed a fragile bulwark against chaos. The officers knew that every choice carried consequences far beyond their own lives. In silence, they contemplated the audacity of relying on death itself to alter the course of the war. And so, the plan began to take shape. A corpse, transformed into a fictional officer, might save thousands of lives, or it might doom them all. The room remained quiet, officers staring at the maps and the fog beyond, knowing that history could be rewritten by a single, terrifyingly bold idea. The selection of a body was not a matter taken lightly. In the cold, sterile morgue, the air hung heavy with the faint tang of disinfectant and the metallic scent of death. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting sharp shadows across tiled walls. Men moved silently, gloves snapping into place, eyes scanning, evaluating. Every detail mattered. Inaccuracy could unravel the entire operation. The corpse chosen would carry the weight of deception, tasked with misleading an enemy across the seas. Officers combed through records and morgue inventories, searching for a body that would appear convincing as a Royal Marine officer. Physical build, age, and condition were scrutinized meticulously. They required someone who looked both authoritative and plausible, whose hands, posture, and clothing could pass as military without arousing suspicion. GLYNDWR Michael, a homeless man who had recently died, became the candidate. His body was unremarkable to those unfamiliar with the mission, but it possessed the quiet neutrality the planners sought. It would serve as a vessel for a lie so precise that the enemy might accept it without question. Even small imperfections, a crooked finger, a blemish, or a misaligned uniform could betray the truth. The pressure on those preparing the corpse was immense. The fate of thousands of soldiers depended on their work. Identification was forged with painstaking care. Dental records were recreated to match the fabricated identity, and personal effects were carefully placed to suggest rank, background, and loyalty. Letters were written in spidery handwriting, receipts folded into uniform pockets, and photographs slipped into wallets. Each item told a story, a coherent fiction crafted to withstand scrutiny. In every detail, authenticity had to be absolute. The atmosphere was tense yet methodical. Workers spoke in clipped tones, avoiding unnecessary words that might disturb the silent presence of death. Scissors, pens, and small tools clicked and scratched as each piece of the illusion was assembled. The body was dressed in a uniform tailored to exacting specifications, boots polished, insignia sewn on with precise alignment. Every wrinkle, every mark, every fold had to convey truth while hiding it. Psychological tension was pervasive. Handling a corpse was not easy, yet these men treated it with professional detachment. Their minds were aware that this was more than a corpse, it was a weapon. The air seemed to vibrate with the paradox. Life had departed, but through careful deception, the body might influence the living in profound ways. Mistakes were unacceptable. Exposure would mean not only the loss of credibility, but potentially thousands of Allied lives on Sicily's beaches. By the end of the day, the preparation was complete. The corpse lay on a steel table, encased in a uniform, carrying documents and tokens that painted a convincing picture of an officer loyal to the British cause. It was lifeless yet charged with the purpose of deception, a silent emissary of calculated terror and strategy. Every mark on the body told a lie the enemy might believe. Every wrinkle, every mark must tell a lie, a deadly one. The offices where the plan took shape were cramped and dimly lit, illuminated only by flickering lamps that cast long, quivering shadows across walls stacked with papers and photographs. The air smelled faintly of ink and dust, mingling with the tension that clung to every corner. Men and women moved quietly, deliberately, each absorbed in a task that demanded absolute precision. In these rooms, imagination became as lethal a weapon as any artillery shell. Every item prepared was part of an intricate psychological trap designed to manipulate enemy minds. The corpse would carry not only a uniform, but an entire fabricated existence. Letters were written in meticulous, careful handwriting messages to a fiancé who did not exist, notes of longing and mundane domestic concerns. Receipts for theater tickets, train rides, and cigarettes were slipped into wallets and pockets. Photographs of friends and family, carefully staged, suggested a life fully lived. Each object was small, seemingly insignificant, yet essential to constructing a reality convincing enough to deceive spies. Documents carried equal weight. Military orders were forged to indicate strategic plans that hinted at an invasion of Greece rather than Sicily. Maps, typed reports, and coded correspondences were arranged to withstand scrutiny by enemy intelligence. Every stamp, date, and signature was checked repeatedly. The planners worked with the clinical detachment of archivists and the imagination of storytellers. Inaccuracy was fatal. A misprinted date or misaligned signature could unravel months of preparation and put thousands of Allied soldiers in jeopardy. The briefcase itself became a symbol of authenticity. It held the curated papers, the letters, and personal tokens, each item deliberately placed to withstand examination. Even the weight and condition of the leather case were considered. It had to feel like a genuine officer's property. Those handling the items moved with quiet reverence, aware that the object in their hands could determine life or death on distant beaches. Psychological tension was constant. The planners imagined the enemy reading every letter, examining every receipt, believing every detail. Each item was a whisper of truth designed to seduce the German mind into making a fatal miscalculation. The knowledge that their work might save thousands or that a single error might doom them pressed on their minds with relentless weight. Their own fears were hidden behind calm, clipped voices, but they were acutely aware that deception was a dangerous game played across thousands of miles. Time moved slowly in the flickering light, each hour spent scrutinizing handwriting, adjusting folds of paper, or correcting minor inconsistencies. Shadows stretched and twisted across walls lined with blueprints and maps. Outside, London's streets were quiet, but inside, the offices were alive with silent urgency. Every movement was precise, every gesture purposeful, every paper an instrument of psychological warfare. By nightfall, the preparations were complete. Letters, photographs, receipts, and documents had been meticulously assembled and placed inside the briefcase. The corpse would now carry a fully formed identity, a fabricated officer whose life existed only on paper and in the imagination of planners. Every item told a story carefully designed to deceive, manipulate, and mislead the enemy. The enemy might read these pages and die believing them. Every detail had to convince spies thousands of miles away. The corpse, carefully prepared and encased in its uniform, was transported to the docks under the cloak of pre-dawn darkness. Mist curled around the piers, clinging to crates and railings, while the salt-laden air stung exposed skin. The hum of engines echoed across the water, blending with the distant cries of seabirds. Men moved silently, aware that any sound might betray the mission to curious eyes. Every step, every gesture, was measured, deliberate, weighed with the knowledge that discovery could doom thousands of lives. HMS Seraph waited at anchor, its steel hull cutting a dark silhouette against the fog. Officers coordinated with naval planners, checking charts, currents, and weather reports. Timing was critical. The corpse had to be released at precisely the right point along the Spanish coast, where German intelligence would find it and accept it as authentic. Any miscalculation could result in the body drifting unnoticed, rendering the elaborate plan useless. The sea itself was both ally and threat, carrying the deception across international waters while also threatening to swallow it entirely in storms or miscalculations. Below decks, the body lay in its prepared container, every document, photograph, and letter intact. The men handling it worked with clinical precision, careful to avoid unnecessary movement. To them, the corpse was not merely dead flesh. It was an instrument of strategy, a silent agent whose presence could alter the course of the war. The psychological weight of this realization pressed heavily on all involved. Though lifeless, the body carried a story, a fabricated life designed to manipulate enemy minds. Each man knew that the success of the entire operation depended on meticulous adherence to procedure. As HMS Seraph cut through the fog, waves slapped against the hull, spraying icy water across decks. Storm clouds approached on the horizon, dark and menacing. Every swell, every gust of wind, threatened to shift the course, to misplace the precious cargo. Officers monitored navigation instruments and coordinated with signals from nearby ships, their faces taut with tension. Every decision was measured, every order precise. The ocean was unpredictable, and in its vastness, a single error could erase weeks of preparation in moments. Men whispered quietly about the audacity of the mission, voices barely audible over the engine's hum. They imagined enemy eyes scanning the coast, analyzing every detail, trusting that the corpse carried the truth. The thought was chilling, a lifeless figure, floating at sea, wielding power over thousands of lives. This was deception elevated to its most macabre form. Psychological tension hung thickly, mingling with the scent of salt, oil, and the faint metallic odor of the prepared corpse. As the ship approached the drop point, crew members double-checked coordinates and conditions. Mist obscured the coastline, hiding movements from potential observers while adding the ever-present uncertainty of navigation. Below, the corpse waited, a silent envoy whose story had yet to be read, whose truth would be judged not by those who prepared it, but by the enemy thousands of miles away. One misstep in the North Atlantic could doom the ruse. The men on deck felt it keenly, the fragile intersection of preparation and chance. One miscalculated wave, one sudden gust of wind, and the body might vanish into the depths, carrying with it the carefully crafted lie that had taken weeks to assemble. In the fog and the salt, secrecy and fear entwined, the plan poised on the knife edge between brilliance and catastrophe. The North Atlantic stretched endlessly, gray and indifferent, as HMS Seraph carved its path through fog and waves. Below deck, the corpse remained hidden, a silent passenger whose presence imbued the submarine-like corridors with tension. Every creak of metal, every gust of wind against the hull reminded the crew of the fragile purpose they carried, a body that could change the course of war. The sea offered no warmth, no comfort, only uncertainty, isolation, and the constant threat of discovery. Sailors moved silently along the cramped decks, eyes constantly scanning the gray horizon through portholes smeared with salt. Even the smallest shadow could be mistaken for an enemy vessel, and the tension was palpable. Officers whispered coordinates and weather updates to one another, their faces taut with focus. Every wave, every swell, seemed to carry the potential for disaster. The corpse below was an instrument of deception, yet it was lifeless, a reminder that the plan's success relied entirely on meticulous execution and human vigilance. Fog hung thick over the ocean, obscuring distant shapes and amplifying the sense of claustrophobia aboard the ship. Inside, the confined compartments smelled faintly of oil, damp wood, and disinfectant from the prepared body. Crew members adjusted straps and checked the case repeatedly, ensuring that the documents and personal effects remained secure. Each man understood that exposure would not only compromise the mission, but also endanger thousands of Allied soldiers waiting for the ruse to succeed. The psychological weight of this knowledge pressed on them with relentless insistence. Suddenly, the weather turned. Dark clouds rolled across the horizon, and the wind picked up with alarming speed. Waves lashed against the hull, sending shudders through the steel frame. Crew members gripped railings, bracing against the surge, hearts quickening. The sea seemed to test their resolve, as if aware of the fragile cargo lying below. Every gust threatened to flood compartments. Every swell risked unbalancing the ship, and with it, the carefully planned deception. The officers monitored instruments and coordinates, issuing quiet, precise commands to maintain course. The men felt a creeping fear that was both rational and irrational. The enemy might be out there, scanning for anomalies, or perhaps the storm itself would betray them. Below, the corpse remained an inert yet central figure, a silent envoy of death and strategy. Its presence transformed routine duties into acts of high-stakes tension, each movement aboard the vessel a calculated measure against chance. Psychological pressure mounted with every hour at sea. Crew members imagined the enemy discovering the body prematurely, reading the letters, and deciphering the false orders. The thought of failure so close, yet so devastating, hung over them like a specter. Waves crashed louder, fog thickened, and the ship groaned under the strain, amplifying the sense of isolation. Even experienced sailors felt the unease seep into their bones. The ocean itself seemed alive, testing courage and resolve. As night fell, the gray sea and the fog merged into a seamless void. Only the hum of engines, the occasional call of a sailor, and the relentless lapping of waves accompanied them. Every moment carried weight. Every second brought the possibility of disaster or success. Below deck, the corpse lay ready, a vessel of deception whose story would soon reach enemy hands. The sea itself seemed to conspire against them. In the North Atlantic, the mission balanced on a knife edge between brilliance and catastrophe, the ocean testing men and machine alike, demanding absolute precision and courage in the face of indifferent, merciless waves. The Spanish coastline emerged through a shroud of fog, jagged cliffs and shadowed beaches barely visible under the muted glow of distant lanterns. HMS Seraph maintained a steady, silent course, every movement calculated to avoid detection. The salt-laden air carried the faint smell of smoke from distant settlements and the sharp tang of the sea. Tension aboard the vessel was palpable. The crew knew that even a single misstep could reveal the operation to enemy eyes or to civilians whose curiosity might prove as dangerous as German intelligence. Below deck, the corpse lay in its container, the carefully arranged letters and documents secured within a briefcase. Officers double-checked every item, ensuring that nothing could slip or be misplaced during deployment. Each letter had been folded, creased, and weighted to appear natural, a story of life fabricated with meticulous precision. The weight of the deception pressed heavily on the men handling it. The knowledge that this lifeless body would soon become a psychological weapon capable of misleading an entire army. On deck, crew members prepared the lifeboat that would carry the corpse to the designated drop point. Straps were tightened, ropes secured, and flotation devices checked. The fog hung thick around the ship, muting sounds and obscuring vision. Every glance toward the coast was cautious, alert for signs of observers, Spanish fishermen, local patrols, or German reconnaissance. Even the faintest light onshore drew tense stares. The psychological tension was almost physical, a quiet weight pressing down on every man, reminding them that one misjudged move could doom the operation. From the bridge, officers monitored the position relative to the beach, factoring in tides, currents, and the time required for the corpse to reach its intended location. Every calculation had been rehearsed, every contingency considered. Yet the unpredictability of the sea and the vigilance of those onshore made the tension inescapable. Shadows moved along the cliffs, and distant figures could be glimpsed through the fog. Spanish fishermen, unaware of the magnitude of the operation, observed the unusual naval maneuvers. Their presence introduced a new variable, an uncontrollable element that could expose the plan at any moment. The crew worked in silence, communicating only through gestures and clipped commands. Below deck, the corpse remained still, an inert figure poised to carry a fabricated identity into enemy hands. The psychological horror of this knowledge was profound. The men imagined German agents discovering the body, reading the letters, and acting upon the false intelligence. The lifeless figure, though incapable of movement, wielded power over human decisions thousands of miles away, shaping lives and battles with nothing more than paper, fabric, and a body. The fog shifted, revealing a faint glimmer of the beach. The waves lapped quietly, yet the ocean's motion reminded everyone aboard that nature itself was unpredictable. One slip, one wave too strong, could sweep the body off course, rendering weeks of preparation useless. Even as preparations neared completion, the tension did not ease. Every creak of wood, every distant shout, every rustle in the mist heightened the fear that the operation could fail at its final stage. Would the body be found by friends or foes? In the shadowed silence of the North Atlantic, with cliffs looming and fog rolling over the beaches, the operation balanced precariously. Every detail, every movement, every calculation mattered. One misstep, and the carefully constructed line might fall into the wrong hands, altering the course of war and exposing lives to unimaginable risk. The corpse had been discovered at dawn, washed onto a quiet beach, its briefcase and letters intact. German intelligence officers arrived quickly, their boots crunching on sand as fog and morning mist hung low over the coast. In the dimly lit office, maps and charts covered the walls, red pins marking known troop positions and suspected Allied movements. The officers moved with methodical precision, each gesture deliberate, each word clipped. Every detail, the uniform, the identification, the letters, was scrutinized under harsh lamplight. The documents were removed from the briefcase and laid across a large oak table. Letters folded and creased to appear authentic, receipts with ink barely dry, photographs depicting a fabricated life, all were examined by officers trained to detect deception. Every officer understood that a single error could compromise an entire front, that one false mark might lead to disaster for troops thousands of miles away. Abwehr intelligence, feared across Europe for its meticulousness, became both the obstacle and the silent arena upon which the Allies' ruse would be tested. Atmosphere in the office was tense, claustrophobic. The hum of a heater, the faint scratching of pens on paper, and the occasional murmur of officers debating formed the soundtrack of the morning. Shadows from the flickering lamps danced across the maps and documents, adding an almost theatrical eeriness to the proceedings. The corpse lay in the corner, an inert, lifeless figure, yet central to every thought, every calculation. Psychological tension was palpable. The officers were aware that deception often came dressed in subtleties, and the line between truth and fabrication was razor thin. Officers compared handwriting, cross-referenced dates, and inspected the small personal effects. They discussed possibilities. weighing whether the intelligence suggested a trap or a genuine message. Doubt crept into their calculations like a silent fog. The letters pointed to Greece as the next target, receipts suggested troop movements, and photographs indicated everyday life, but all details were crafted to appear natural. Each minor imperfection was dissected, yet none could definitively betray the fabrication. The room was a battlefield of minds. Officers whispered, debated, and gestured at maps, imagining strategies, anticipating moves, fearing deception. Every glance at the corpse was a reminder that war was no longer fought solely with guns or bombs. It had entered the realm of the psychological. The Allies had weaponized perception, and the enemy's minds had become both the target and the theater of operations. The officers' hesitation, their paranoia, was precisely the intended effect of the meticulously constructed lie. Outside, the fog over the coast remained dense, hiding the true direction of enemy movements. Inside, the officers grappled with the possibility that the body might be a trap. Even the most skeptical glanced nervously at their colleagues, knowing that any misjudgment could mean lives lost on a scale they could not yet comprehend. The psychological weight of suspicion pressed on every officer. The line between doubt and belief became perilously thin. A single skeptical glance could destroy the deception. In that dimly lit room, amidst maps and letters, the corpse had already achieved its purpose. Minds were manipulated, doubt had taken root, and the battlefield had shifted from beaches and coasts to thoughts and perceptions. One hesitant decision, one misread sign, could unravel weeks of planning or inadvertently save thousands of lives. The war had entered a new, chilling phase, where death itself carried a story, and every mind that believed or questioned became part of the operation. Inside the dimly lit office, the air hung thick with cigar smoke and the faint tang of ink. Maps lined the walls, dotted with pins and annotations, marking troop positions and suspected Allied movements. German officers hunched over tables, whispering in clipped tones as they scrutinized the documents and personal effects discovered on the Spanish beach. Each photograph, each receipt, each letter was examined with meticulous care. Yet the more they studied, the more uncertainty crept into their minds. The letters, folded with deliberate care and written in seemingly casual handwriting, spoke of officers' lives, travels, and plans that suggested troop deployments far from Sicily. Receipts indicated everyday routines, minor purchases, payments, and correspondence, but all hinted subtly at Greece as a target. Photographs depicted a fabricated family life, a story meant to make the corpse's identity convincing. The officers debated each item: was it genuine or an elaborate ruse? Their eyes flickered nervously between maps and papers, aware that a single misjudgment could imperil entire divisions. Atmosphere in the room was oppressive. Shadows cast by flickering lamps stretched across walls, moving with each cautious gesture. Whispered arguments echoed off the fogged windows as officers questioned one another and themselves. Every small detail became suspect. Even seasoned veterans, trained to detect deception, felt the unease settle into their bones. The enemy had weaponized subtlety, using the corpse and its effects to infiltrate minds rather than battlefields. As the hours passed, hesitation grew. Officers delayed issuing orders, fearing that any movement could reveal a trap. The letters, crafted with intricate care, had done their work. Uncertainty had replaced confidence. Strategic decisions that should have been clear were now clouded by doubt. Each officer imagined possible ambushes. Every detachment they might send potentially walking into a snare. The documents were no longer inert, they had become agents of fear. Psychological tension mounted. Conversations became measured, almost ritualistic, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile trust they placed in their own judgment. Paranoia seeped into every decision. Commanders questioned subordinates, officers mistrusted colleagues, and uncertainty shaped the placement of entire units. The corpse itself, lying miles away under the ocean, exerted influence without movement or sound. It had shifted the battlefield from sand and sea to thought and hesitation. Mistaken interpretations began to affect troop deployments. Forces were held back from Sicily, repositioned unnecessarily, or delayed in preparation. Even minor uncertainties about the authenticity of the papers caused ripple effects across divisions. The Allies' plan had succeeded in a way few could imagine. The enemy's own mind became the weapon, and the threat of the body was more potent than any explosive device. The enemy's minds became the battlefield. In that shadowed office, surrounded by maps, papers, and the weight of indecision, German officers found themselves ensnared not by fire or steel, but by suggestion, paranoia, and fear. The corpse, inert and silent, had wrought chaos without action. Every hesitant glance, every whispered debate, reinforced the Allies' control, and the psychological shadow of the deception extended far beyond the beach where the body had washed ashore. The enemy's own mind betrayed them more than bombs ever could. Below deck on HMS Seraph, the air was heavy with anticipation. Officers sat in dimly lit control rooms, hunched over radio receivers, maps, and coded messages. The faint hum of equipment was punctuated by the occasional crackle of distant transmissions, each sound heightening tension rather than relieving it. Every intercepted German report was examined with painstaking care, each phrase parsed for signs of understanding, hesitation, or suspicion. The mission depended not on speed or force, but on patience. Hours stretched into days, and the officers' nerves began to fray. Each report that arrived brought both relief and anxiety. The enemy seemed uncertain, yet any premature movement could unravel months of planning. The body had been found, the letters read, the personal effects scrutinized. Now, the British waited, watching for the subtle reactions that would reveal whether their carefully constructed deception had taken hold. Atmosphere aboard the ship was tense and oppressive. The faint smell of machinery and salt water filled the air, mingling with the metallic scent of ink from maps and documents. Officers moved quietly, speaking only, when necessary, their faces etched with focus and worry. They knew that one false move, one incorrect interpretation of the Germans' actions, might compromise the entire operation and cost thousands of lives during the impending Sicilian invasion. Each intercepted message from German intelligence was a psychological test. Officers analyzed syntax, timing, and word choice, seeking patterns that might indicate belief or skepticism. The corpse, lying miles away on a Spanish beach, had already become an agent of chaos, influencing decisions without a single word spoken. Now, its effect was being measured. Would the enemy reposition their forces, delay reinforcements, or act rashly? Every minor movement was significant, every hesitation critical. The tension was almost physical, pressing down on the men like a dense fog. Every hour felt like a lifetime. Every moment stretched into an eternity of anticipation. Officers cross-referenced intercepted reports with maps and previous intelligence, calculating probabilities, estimating outcomes, and preparing contingency plans. The weight of responsibility was immense. Not only the lives of Allied soldiers, but the success of the larger invasion hung in balance. Psychological horror permeated the quiet. Below deck, men stared at flickering screens, imagining the potential consequences of failure. Would the Germans detect the ruse too early? Would the deception last long enough to draw forces away from Sicily? The uncertainty gnawed at them. The operation was a delicate balance between strategy and chance, and the invisible enemy of doubt loomed large over every decision. The fog outside mirrored the suspense inside, thick and impenetrable. Officers watched for patterns in reports, for any sign that the enemy might move prematurely. The body had been only the beginning. The real battlefield now existed in the minds of those thousands of miles away. Every letter read, every rumor heard, every hesitation observed had the power to change the course of history. Every letter read, every rumor heard, might change history. In the silent, shadowed rooms of HMS Seraph, the British waited. The operation was not measured in bullets or explosions, but in time, perception, and careful observation. The psychological tension was relentless, yet every officer understood that patience was as lethal a weapon as any torpedo or artillery shell. The question hung over them like the gray fog outside: would the deception hold long enough to save lives? The war rooms in Berlin were tense, but methodical. Officers stood over large maps spread across oak tables, their hands tracing the movements of divisions, noting every shift in placement, every reassignment of troops. The atmosphere was clinical, almost antiseptic, though the air hummed with the weight of decisions that could mean life or death for thousands. Reports from field intelligence indicated unusual redeployments, as if entire divisions were being shifted to counter a threat that did not exist. The Germans had read the letters, examined the briefcase, and absorbed the personal effects carried by the corpse. The deception had taken hold. Troops were moved from strategic points near Sicily to locations far away, drawn by the suggestion of an impending Allied landing. Officers discussed these shifts with precision, calculating supply lines, timing, and the effect on defensive capabilities. Each decision was executed with care, yet it was built on a foundation of falsehood, a phantom army influencing the flow of real lives. In quiet corners, analysts marked positions on model layouts of the battlefield. Pins were placed, small flags shifted, and movements traced in precise patterns. Each tiny adjustment represented thousands of soldiers, hundreds of vehicles, and scores of artillery pieces relocating in response to misinformation. The chessboard of Europe had been altered by a corpse, a few letters, and carefully constructed lies. Psychological horror permeated the Allied observation posts. Far from Berlin, officers aboard HMS Seraph and in other intelligence stations monitored these movements in silence. Every troop relocation was measured, recorded, and analyzed. Each map and report represented lives at stake. Yet these decisions were guided not by fact, but by suggestion. The Allies could calculate the effect of every lie, knowing that strategic deception could reduce casualties during the impending invasion. And yet, the weight of the cost, the lives affected by the enemy's choices, was ever present. Officers in German war rooms moved with purpose, issuing orders, communicating via telephone and radio. Their confidence was visible, but it was confidence built upon misdirection. Every intercepted message and every new positioning confirmed the effectiveness of the ruse. They believed they were responding to a real threat, but in truth, the entire operation had been orchestrated from afar, with the corpse at its center. The atmosphere was both mechanical and eerie. Lamps cast long shadows across the maps, the ticking of clocks and the murmur of officers providing a steady rhythm against which massive strategic shifts occurred. The psychological weight of these movements, decisions made based on false intelligence, was palpable to the Allied observers who tracked each step in meticulous silence. The battlefield had expanded beyond land, sea, or air. Now, it existed in minds manipulated by suggestion, fear, and falsehood. Troop movements danced like shadows on a chessboard of death. In the quiet tension of war rooms and observation posts, the Allies watched as the enemy unknowingly reduced their own defenses, playing into a plan crafted with precision, patience, and psychological insight. Every shift of a division, every delayed reinforcement, every misallocation of resources reinforced the value of deception as a weapon. And as the maps were adjusted and orders sent, the Allied command understood the stakes. The chessboard had shifted, thousands of lives rested on perception, and history waited for the next move. The chessboard shifted, and history waited on the next move. The first light of dawn over Sicily revealed a scene of calculated chaos. Allied forces landed on beaches long targeted for assault, their boats cutting through mist-laden waters with muted engines. The horizon was a haze of fog and smoke, punctuated by distant echoes of artillery. Yet, despite the intensity of the operation, the number of casualties remained far below projections. The reason was not superior firepower or perfect strategy. It was the enemy's misperception, crafted in shadows and lies. Officers observed from command posts, scanning maps and tracking units as German divisions moved hesitantly or remained absent from the expected points of resistance. Troop deployments, delayed by false intelligence and phantom threats, left stretches of coastline vulnerable. Soldiers pressed forward, securing beaches with minimal opposition, unaware that the skeleton of a corpse, letters, and forged documents had played a decisive role in shaping the battlefield. The atmosphere was tense but measured. Fog clung to the shoreline, waves breaking quietly against landing crafts, and the distant rattle of gunfire was sporadic, almost surreal. Every step taken by the troops was shadowed by the knowledge that success had been achieved not solely through courage, but through deception executed thousands of miles away. The psychological weight of this realization rested lightly on the commanding officers, who knew the victory depended as much on minds as on weaponry. Within German command centers, officers scrambled to interpret the unfolding situation. Confusion reigned. Units arrived late, others were misplaced entirely, and reconnaissance reports failed to correspond with reality. Orders issued with urgency were based on the belief that Sicily faced a massive, imminent assault. Yet the reality on the ground contradicted every expectation. Here, the meticulous orchestration of Operation Mincemeat manifested, lives spared, ground secured, all because the enemy acted upon falsehoods meticulously planted weeks before. Psychological horror underpinned every movement. Allied soldiers advanced over sand and rocky terrain, witnessing occasional bursts of resistance, but largely finding abandoned defenses. Each secured position, each unopposed beach, represented lives saved at the expense of thousands of soldiers maneuvering under the belief they faced a threat far greater than reality. Victory was tangible in maps, reports, and photographs, yet its true origin remained invisible, hidden behind the guise of normal wartime operations. Commanders communicated quietly, issuing orders that synchronized land, air, and naval units. Ships off the coast provided supporting fire, while aircraft overhead maintained reconnaissance, all calibrated to the enemy's mispositioned defenses. Every action was amplified by the enemy's hesitation and misjudgment, a direct consequence of a corpse and its fabricated story. The deception was complete. It dictated the flow of battle without a single shot fired by those who had created it. The war's outcome hinged on lies and the dead. By midday, the beaches were largely secured. Soldiers moved inland, encountering sporadic resistance but achieving objectives faster and with fewer losses than intelligence had predicted. Operation Mincemeat had succeeded beyond expectation. German divisions were misdirected, their response delayed, and the Allies advanced with relative ease. Yet, the cost was measured not in fire or explosions, but in the silence of secrecy, in the knowledge that the true architect of victory was a corpse, a briefcase, and the shadows of deception. The war was won, but in silence and secrecy. The landings in Sicily had concluded with remarkable efficiency. Allied troops secured beaches, captured strategic points, and reported fewer casualties than anticipated. Yet, within the quiet of command offices, away from the celebratory reports and marching soldiers, officers confronted a more complex reality. Victory had been won, yes, but at what cost to conscience and ethics? The war rooms were dimly lit, maps laid out in careful arrangements, documents strewn across oak tables. Officers moved with methodical precision, reviewing reports of German troop movements, analyzing after-action data, and noting the strategic success of their ruse. Every line on the map reflected not just troop placements, but the manipulation of enemy perception. The deception had worked flawlessly. Divisions had been diverted, reinforcements delayed, and objectives achieved with minimal bloodshed. Yet the method, the use of a corpse as a weapon, hung over the room like a spectral presence. The atmosphere was thick with psychological tension. Men who had spent months preparing Operation Mincemeat now understood the profound moral complexity of their work. GLYNDWR Michael, a homeless man, had been transformed into a tool of war, his death harnessed to mislead an enemy and save thousands of Allied lives. The office, usually a place of detached calculation, seemed haunted. Papers rustled under the faint draft, shadows from flickering lamps danced across the walls, and the absence of triumphant noise allowed space for reflection. Factual elements were methodically cataloged, letters and photographs planted in the briefcase, naval coordination off the Spanish coast, the careful monitoring of German intelligence, and the strategic outcomes on Sicilian soil. Each detail underscored the precision of planning, yet each also reminded officers of the human cost. The mission had succeeded, but it had done so by weaponizing mortality itself. Psychological horror lay not in the enemy's losses, but in the quiet acknowledgement that victory had been orchestrated through death, deception, and the manipulation of minds. Officers questioned the morality of their choices, debating whether the end justified the means. Could a triumph built on lies and corpses truly be celebrated? Or did it leave an indelible shadow on all who had participated? The silence in the room seemed to answer. The victory was haunted. Discussions continued, clinical in tone, yet haunted by unspoken dread. They analyzed every aspect of the operation, considering how the deception had altered German movements, delayed troop deployments, and ultimately contributed to a smoother Allied invasion. The success was undeniable, but the triumph was complicated. The eyes that once calculated numbers and coordinates now glimpsed a spectral presence. The corpse that had swayed battle plans, lying lifeless yet profoundly influential, a reminder of the ethical ambiguity of warfare. Did victory taste like triumph or something darker? The officers, though proud of their strategic ingenuity, carried the knowledge privately. Success had been achieved without traditional combat, but through a manipulation so precise and psychologically penetrating that its architects bore the weight alone. Allies celebrated on the beaches, soldiers raised flags, and dispatches chronicled tactical efficiency. Yet behind closed doors, in the dim glow of maps and reports, the true architects of victory wrestled with shadows, the moral and emotional consequences of a war fought in whispers, letters, and the dead. Success carried a shadow, visible only to the few who knew the truth. The operation would remain a secret for decades, a hidden triumph that shaped history from the shadows. For the officers and planners, the cost of victory was measured not in bullets or bombs, but in conscience and quiet reflection. The HMS Seraph cut through the North Atlantic with deliberate calm, its engines a muted hum beneath the rolling fog. The mission was complete, yet the atmosphere aboard the vessel was anything but celebratory. The corpse, meticulously prepared, had served its purpose, delivering deception that would save thousands of lives during the invasion of Sicily. Still, the crew and officers understood that their triumph would not be heralded with medals or parades. History would bury their achievement beneath layers of secrecy. Inside the ship, officers moved quietly, reviewing logs and sealing documents in official folders. Every report, every note, every photograph was carefully cataloged, to be locked away in archives for decades. The mission's details were too sensitive, its ethical and strategic implications too profound for public knowledge. Shadows of reflection stretched long across the decks. Men who had witnessed, handled, and facilitated the ruse now carried an invisible weight. Their eyes were steady, but their thoughts circled in quiet turmoil. The atmosphere was hushed, punctuated only by the gentle slap of waves against the hull and the occasional creak of the wooden decks beneath boots. Conversations were muted, discussions clinical yet burdened with unspoken emotion. Officers pondered the moral ambiguity of their work. The body of GLYNDWR Michael, a homeless man, had been transformed into an instrument of war. They had forged letters, planted documents, and manipulated intelligence, all to trick an enemy into misdirected action. The success was undeniable, but the cost was measured in conscience and ethical reflection. Factual elements reinforced the gravity of the operation. HMS Seraph had delivered the corpse near the Spanish coast, the letters and briefcase strategically placed to mislead German intelligence. Aware officers intercepted the material, debated its authenticity, and ultimately repositioned divisions in response to the deception. The Allied invasion of Sicily proceeded with fewer casualties precisely because a single life, long gone, had been wielded as a tool of war. This was the silent triumph of psychological warfare, hidden from public view. Psychological horror lay in the invisibility of their success. Crew members walked the decks knowing that the world would never witness the mission's intricacies, that no glory would come from their actions. They had influenced the course of battle with nothing more than shadows, letters, and the body of a man who could no longer speak. The living carried the story in silence. The dead bore it forever. Pride intertwined with guilt, for the achievement could never be publicly celebrated. As HMS Seraph approached port, the fog thickened along the horizon. Officers and sailors alike stared into the gray mist, reflecting on the duality of their service. The sea, once an avenue for action, now became a corridor of secrecy and contemplation. Every member of the crew knew that the mission's success depended as much on discretion as on execution. No photographs, no medals, no public recognition would mark their contribution. Their triumph was ghostly, recorded only in silent logs and classified archives. Heroes unseen, their triumph buried beneath layers of secrecy. The vessel docked quietly, and the crew disembarked into the anonymity of civilian life. The war continued, the invasion unfolded, and history marched forward, oblivious to the shadowed influence of a single, calculated deception. Yet, in the minds of those aboard HMS Seraph, the story remained vivid, an invisible mark on conscience and memory. The dead carried stories the living could not speak. The sea had delivered its message, yet its whispers would echo in silence for decades. The mission's triumph would remain unseen, an operation hidden in shadows, haunting those who had borne witness to its meticulous execution. Decades after the war, the story of Operation Mincemeat emerged from the shadows of secrecy, not as a tale of valor with rifles and bullets, but as a case study in meticulous psychological warfare. In quiet libraries and secure intelligence archives, historians, military strategists, and operatives pored over the meticulously cataloged files that had remained classified for years. The brilliance of the deception turning a corpse into a weapon to manipulate the enemy was recognized as a milestone in the art of intelligence. The atmosphere was one of hushed contemplation. Scholars sifted through faded documents, letters, and photographs, while analysts from intelligence agencies traced the operation's ripple effects on enemy decisions. The room smelled faintly of old paper and ink, and the flickering light of desk lamps cast long shadows over stacks of files. Each item in the archives told a story not of conventional battlefield heroics, but of minds engaged in a far subtler, yet no less lethal, struggle. Operation Mincemeat's success had been built on fear, suggestion, and the exploitation of enemy assumptions. The Germans had intercepted the letters, examined the forged personal effects, and, in their paranoia, had redeployed divisions away from Sicily. Historians marveled at the precision with which the deception manipulated enemy perception, noting that a single misstep could have revealed the ruse and cost thousands of lives. The operation's elegance lay in its invisibility, the way a dead man, silent and immobile, could dictate the movements of armies and alter the course of an entire campaign. Psychological horror echoed in these studies, not in explosions or bloodshed, but in the haunting knowledge that the dead had wielded influence over the living. The mission illustrated how perception and belief could be weaponized, that terror, expectation, and suggestion could move troops as effectively as any artillery barrage. Analysts noted that the aware officers, ensnared by the carefully constructed false identity of Major William Martin, became unknowing actors in a battle of shadows. Their minds, manipulated by meticulous planning and subtle cues, became the battlefield itself. Factual elements highlighted in these studies underscored the operation's lasting significance. GLYNDWR Michael's body, the forged documents, the coordinated naval delivery, and the timing that ensured interception. Intelligence agencies such as MI5 and MI6 later cited the operation as exemplary in training programs, demonstrating how creativity, patience, and psychological insight could save lives and secure strategic advantage. The operation's ingenuity was now recognized publicly, its lessons embedded in military doctrine. Yet, even as recognition grew, a haunting truth persisted. The war's casualties had been real, and the mission's ethical ambiguity remained palpable. Those who orchestrated the plan had carried the burden silently, their triumphs uncelebrated, their moral compromises invisible to the world. The shadows they manipulated to achieve victory lingered long after, a reminder that the most effective operations were often those that left no visible trace. History remembers battles, but shadows write their own stories. The operation, once buried in secrecy, now illuminated the power of psychological strategy. Scholars and spies alike acknowledged that warfare extended beyond guns and tanks into the realm of mind games, perception, and the manipulation of belief. The shadows of Operation Mincemeat continued to influence military planning, proving that intelligence, subtlety, and imagination could shape outcomes as profoundly as force. The shadows lingered long after the war ended. Even as peace settled across Europe, the echoes of deception remained embedded in military thought, an enduring testament to the potency of ingenuity, the dead, and the unseen hands that shape history. Operation Mincemeat, once buried in the secrecy of wartime intelligence, now occupies a strange space between myth and history. The story is not told in medals, parades, or the roar of guns, but in black and white photographs, faded documents, and silent museum displays. It is a tale of a man who never lived, yet whose death shaped the course of war. The air is heavy with the quiet weight of secrets, the kind that linger long after the last battles are fought. In quiet archives, the files of Operation Mincemeat are spread across tables. Letters, receipts, photographs, and forged identification mark the meticulous care that transformed a corpse into a strategic weapon. Historians trace each line, each mark of forgery, each carefully planted document, recognizing the audacity and ingenuity of the plan. The Allied invasion of Sicily succeeded not solely through firepower, but through deception, through manipulating enemy minds, exploiting fear and expectation. Troop movements danced according to a lie, and yet the lie saved thousands of lives. The psychological horror of the operation is not in explosions or blood, but in the silent hand of the dead. Glynndwr Michael's body, chosen and prepared with painstaking care, carried a story that could kill or misdirect, a story that commanded entire divisions without uttering a word. The dead shaped history. Officers and soldiers, unaware, were drawn into a narrative crafted by meticulous minds, responding to shadows, rumors, and documents. The battlefield extended beyond Sicily, beyond guns and shells, into the consciousness of those who would have opposed the Allies. Museums and archives now display photographs of the men who planned the operation, their faces etched with concentration, their eyes burdened by secrecy. The moral ambiguities hover like ghosts. To manipulate belief, to use a corpse as a weapon, required a detachment few could endure. Yet the success of the mission is undeniable. The German response was delayed, divisions were mispositioned, and the Sicilian invasion faced fewer casualties than feared. The victory was real, yet invisible, a triumph of intellect and courage performed in silence. Visitors reading the documents feel the strange tension between life and death, ethics and necessity. The operation challenges the conventional understanding of heroism. There is no cannonade to mark victory, no hero to celebrate in the streets. Instead, history whispers the story of a man who never existed, whose body and identity were instruments of survival, shaping the fate of nations. It is a reminder that wars are not only fought with rifles, tanks, or aircraft, but also with minds, perceptions, and shadows. A man who never lived saved thousands, and war itself whispered the secret of shadows. The legacy of Operation Mincemeat endures as both a masterclass in strategic deception and a haunting meditation on the ethics of war. The audacity of the plan, the precision of its execution, and the silence of its acknowledgement reveal a dimension of warfare often overlooked: the power of illusion, of suggestion, and of the human mind as both tool and battlefield. Even decades later, the shadow of that plan lingers, echoing in military academies, intelligence studies, and silent archives. Operation Mincemeat proves that in war, victory doesn't always roar, sometimes it whispers through shadows. A man who never lived shaped history, deceived an entire army, and saved thousands, yet his story remained buried for decades. This is the secret history of deception, courage, and moral ambiguity that few dare to tell. If you found this story as haunting and mind-bending as I did, smash the like button, share it with fellow history fans, and subscribe to Battlefield Secrets, because the darkest stories are often the ones history forgot.